At the height of the 1870s, in the cities where German was still the first language on many of the streets, St. Louis on the Mississippi, Milwaukee on the western shore of Lake Michigan, a small mining town in Colorado called Golden, a certain evening scene had begun to repeat itself. A man came home from a foundry, or from a railway yard, or from a slaughterhouse floor, and he sat down at a wooden table. He was tired. He was very often only a few years off the boat himself. And in front of him, in a glass he could see through for the first time in his life, because the beer of his childhood, in the small Rhineland or Silesian or Bavarian villages he had left behind, had been served in stoneware, and had been opaque, and had been drunk warm. There was now a pale, cold, faintly bitter liquid that he had grown up drinking under a different name, in a country he was never going back to. The liquid had a small collar of white foam. It caught the amber light of the tavern lamp. It was technically a lager, a bottom-fermented beer of the Bavarian tradition, brewed with barley malt and Bohemian hops and stored, before it reached him, for 6 weeks at a temperature just above the freezing point of water. Almost none of the men drinking it could have said any of that. What they knew, what they were, in the strictest sense, being sold, was a small and very reliable domestic pleasure at the end of a very hard American day. This is a documentary about that glass, about the 4 families who filled it, about the German technical genius that produced it, pasteurization, refrigeration, the first truly national brand, and about the American appetite that, for roughly 100 years, could not seem to stop drinking it. It is also a documentary about how each of these families, in its own way and at its own slow speed, drank the fortune away. Their names are on the label still. Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, Schlitz, Coors. Behind each label is a man who arrived, in most cases, with a small suitcase, and behind each man is a son, or a grandson, or a great-grandson, who eventually signed a piece of paper he had once sworn he would never sign. And in one case, at the very end of the century that these 4 families had defined, that piece of paper was signed in a language none of them had ever spoken, Flemish, and it was signed in a boardroom in Leuven, in Belgium, for $70 a share. Subscribe for more documentaries on the great dynasties of old money. New episodes every week. 4 families, 4 cities, 1 long thirst. The story of the Anheuser-Busch fortune begins, unusually for an American brewing empire, with a man who had almost nothing to do with beer. His name was Eberhard Anheuser, and he was born on the 27th of September, 1806, in the small Rhineland town of Kreuznach. In the middle of a river valley his family had been farming since the 1620s. He had trained in the German fashion as a chemist, and when he emigrated to the United States in the early 1840s, arriving first in Cincinnati, and then, by 1845, settling in the city that had already become the largest German-speaking capital west of the Alleghenies, St. Louis, Missouri, he did not go into brewing. He went into soap. For 15 years, Eberhard Anheuser manufactured soap and candles. He did well at it. He became, by the standards of his generation of German immigrants, a wealthy man, and he was known in the German-language business circles of St. Louis as a careful, reserved figure who spoke slowly, in a Rhineland accent, and who kept his accounts to the penny. He was also, in the way of many prosperous German Americans of that decade, a small investor in other enterprises. And one of those enterprises was a struggling brewery on 8th Street, in the Soulard neighborhood of St. Louis, that had been founded in 1852 by another German immigrant, Georg Schneider, under the name of the Bavarian Brewery. The Bavarian Brewery was failing. It had passed, in less than a decade, through the hands of several owners, each of them attempting, and each of them not quite managing, to make a lager beer that would sell in a river town where the competition. There were, by 1853, 36 breweries in St. Louis alone, was ferocious. By the end of 1860, Anheuser had bought out the last of the other creditors and taken sole control. He was 54 years old. He had spent almost all his working life turning fat into cleanliness. And now, without knowing very much about barley, he was going to have to learn to turn barley into money. He might have failed. He very nearly did fail. And what saved him was, in the way of these things, a marriage. In 1857, 3 years before Anheuser took over the brewery, a young man had arrived in St. Louis from the German town of Kastel, near Mainz. His name was Adolphus Busch. He was 18 years old, and he was the 21st of 22 children born to a wealthy Rhineland merchant who dealt, among other things, in brewer's supplies. Adolphus had been well educated, the gymnasium in Mainz, an academy in Darmstadt, the Collegiate Institute of Belgium in Brussels, and he had come to America, as he would say later, because there was quite simply no room for him in a household that already contained 20 older siblings with prior claims to everything. He came in through the Gulf of Mexico. He came up the river. He arrived as almost every ambitious German-speaking young man of that decade arrived, in St. Louis, and within a few years, he had established, with his brothers, a small firm that sold brewers' supplies to the roughly 40 breweries of the city, including, before very long, the ailing Bavarian brewery on 8th Street. That was how he met Eberhard Anheuser. It was how, in the end, he met Anheuser's daughter, Lily. And on the 7th of March, 1861, in a double wedding on a Thursday afternoon in St. Louis, Adolphus Busch married Lily Anheuser, while his older brother Ulrich married Lily's older sister Anna. A little over a month later, the American Civil War began, and Adolphus enlisted briefly in the Union Army in a Missouri Reserve unit. He served 3 months. Then he came home to his wife, to his father-in-law, and to a small, unpromising brewery on 8th Street. What happened next has been told, in the mythology of American beer, so often that it is easy to forget how genuinely improbable it was. Between 1865, when Adolphus formally entered into partnership with Anheuser, and 1901, when Anheuser-Busch became the largest brewery in the United States, this man, a young man from the Rhine Valley who had arrived a few years earlier with a small inheritance, did 4 things. He was among the first American brewers to adopt pasteurisation, the heat treatment developed by Louis Pasteur in France in the 1860s, which killed the microbes that had, until then, turned beer sour within a few weeks of leaving the barrel. It was a subtle and, by the standards of the industry, a slightly counterintuitive intervention. Traditional brewers regarded the heating of beer as blasphemy against the yeast. Adolphus Busch, who had trained in the German scientific tradition and who had read every issue of the Bavarian Brewing Journal since his youth, understood almost immediately that pasteurization was not the end of the beer, but the beginning of its commercial life. That it turned a fresh, local, unstable liquid into a durable, shippable product that could travel, in principle, anywhere in the country. He invested, early and heavily, in the refrigerated railway car, whose interior temperature could be maintained by insulated ice bunkers for days on end, and which allowed him to ship the now stable beer thousands of miles into every state that had a railway station. He built glass factories to supply his own bottles, so that his product could sit on a store shelf in his own distinctive containers and be recognized and be picked up. And in 1891, he bought the trademark for a name that had been used informally by a small brewery in his own former linguistic region of Central Europe, the Bohemian town of Budweiser, in what is now the Czech Republic. He paid a St. Louis wine merchant named Carl Conrad for the American rights, and he began to sell it systematically in every city that his railcars could reach. The name was Budweiser. It would become, within 30 years of the trademark purchase, the single most widely distributed alcoholic beverage in the world. By 1899, Adolphus Busch was one of the wealthiest men in the American Middle West. He lived in a mansion. His personal address was No. 1 Busch Place, in the middle of his own brewery complex, and he traveled between St. Louis and the Rhineland in a private railway car that he had ordered built for himself and named, with the immodesty that his employees quietly noted and never mentioned, the Adolphus. He had, at various points in his career, been described by his own workers as a man who liked to say, at the height of a good mood, "See, just like der King." He was not a modest man. He was also not, by the accounts of those who knew him, a particularly cruel one. He gave over his lifetime more than $300,000 to Harvard University for the endowment of a Germanic museum, and he gave $100,000 to the city of San Francisco after the earthquake of 1906. He liked to be seen giving, and he made sure that he was. In the late years of his life, Adolphus began to feel the accumulated weight of what 19th century doctors called dropsy quies, a swelling that we would now call congestive heart failure. He and Lily built a country house in Germany in a small Rhineland resort town called Bad Schwalbach. They named it Villa Lily after her. And it was there on the 10th of October, 1913, at 4 in the afternoon that Adolphus Busch had a heart attack while sitting at his desk and died a few hours later at the age of 74. His body was placed on the German ocean liner Kronprinz Wilhelm and returned to St. Louis. It arrived on the 25th of October. Over 30,000 people passed through the drawing room of number 1 Busch Place to see the coffin. The floral tributes, when they were finally loaded for the procession to Bellefontaine Cemetery, filled 25 delivery trucks, and the florists of St. Louis were sold out for miles in every direction. An estimated 100,000 people lined the streets. A representative of the German emperor stood among the honorary pallbearers. On the mausoleum, which Lily would later commission in Bavarian Gothic stone, she had 3 Latin words carved above the door: Veni, Vidi, Vici. He came, he saw, he conquered. He had. And now, 6 years before the United States would ban the sale of the product he had spent his life perfecting, he was gone. The son who took the company was August Anheuser Busch Sr., known in the family simply as Augustus. He was 47 years old when his father died. He was a competent brewer and an efficient administrator, but the industry into which he inherited was one that had already lost the battle he had spent his adult life fighting. On the 16th of January, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the American Constitution came into force. It was, in effect, illegal to make or sell beer. Anheuser-Busch survived. It survived because Adolphus, as early as 1908, had already ordered his chemist to develop a non-alcoholic malt beverage that could be sold as a substitute, a product called bevo, from the Slavic word for beer, pivo. It survived because August Sr. sold half the company's real estate to raise cash. It survived because it invested in refrigerated ice cream trucks and in a chocolate soft drink and in something called Busch tea and in frozen egg products and in infant formula and in the manufacture of refrigerated cabinets for retailers who had no beer left to sell. It survived because it was, in every practical sense, no longer a brewery for those 13 years, but it kept the buildings warm and the workforce partly employed, and when Prohibition ended on the 5th of December, 1933, it was one of the few large American breweries that was ready to open the taps again on the first day of legal beer. August Sr. did not live to see the empire rebuild itself. On the 10th of February, 1934, at his home in St. Louis, he died in circumstances that his family, and later his biographers, would treat with a great and careful reticence. He had been ill for a long time. He had suffered from an unspecified degenerative condition. The street. Lewis Coroner ruled the death a suicide brought on, in the language of the day, by long illness. The obituaries described him as a worthy son of a great father. His wife, the newspapers noted, had preserved a certain dignity throughout. His eldest son, Adolphus Busch III, took over the company. He held it through the Depression and through the Second World War. He died of cancer in 1946 at Barnes Hospital in St. Louis, at the age of 55. And then in that same year, the leadership passed to his younger brother, August Anheuser Busch Jr., universally known, in and out of the family, as Gussie. Gussie was the 3rd generation. He was also, by every account, the last of the family to actually enjoy the work. He was a large, extroverted, cigar-smoking man who wore red cowboy hats to baseball games, who bred Clydesdale horses on his estate at Grant's Farm outside St. Louis, and who, in 1953, persuaded the company's board of directors to buy the St. Louis Cardinals of the National League. Under him, Anheuser-Busch built 12 new breweries across the country, and in 1957 it once again became the largest brewery in the world. Gussie ran the company until 1975. He died at the age of 90 on the 29th of September, 1989. And after him, the 2 generations who followed, his son August Busch III, born in 1937, and his grandson August Busch IV, born in 1964, carried the family name at the head of the corporation for a further 3 decades. But something had changed. Or more accurately, something had not changed while everything else had. Anheuser-Busch was still, by the turn of the 21st century, the largest brewery in the United States. It was no longer the largest in the world. That title had passed, quietly, to a Belgian-Brazilian consortium called InBev, which had spent the previous decade acquiring smaller breweries all over Europe and South America, and which in June of 2008 made an unsolicited offer for the company that Adolphus Busch had built. August Busch IV, who had become chief executive only a year earlier, told the American beer distributors, in a private meeting in April of that year, that Anheuser-Busch would never be bought, as he put it, on his watch. 2 months later, InBev raised the offer to $70 a share. The board convened. It considered the alternatives. It concluded in the polite phrase used later by the fourth himself in his statement to the shareholders' meeting on the 12th of November that the offer represented full and certain value. The shareholders voted. The deal closed on the 18th of November, 2008, 6 days before the end of the American recession year. August Busch IV received, according to the company's filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission, roughly $100 million for his own shares, and a consulting contract of $120,000 a month through the end of 2013. He kept his seat on the board of the newly renamed Anheuser-Busch InBev. He had done what he had promised he would never do. And he had done it, according to journalists who later reported on the negotiations, with the quiet backing of his own father, August III, who had never entirely forgiven the fourth for what he considered to be the mishandling of the company in the years leading up to the offer. In the language of one former Anheuser-Busch archivist, quoted in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that summer, it was not exactly vindictiveness. It was something close to it. 156 years after Georg Schneider had opened the Bavarian Brewery on 8th Street in St. Louis, and 147 years after Adolphus Busch had married Lily Anheuser in a double wedding on a March afternoon, the family lost its brewery. Some fortunes, one is tempted to say, are not so much spent as inherited past the point of use. The second story begins on the water, in the small Saxon village of Nikolausrieth in the Kingdom of Prussia. On the 28th of March, 1836, a farmer's wife gave birth to a son. His full name, the German name, was Johann Gottlieb Friedrich Pabst, and he was the second child of a small farmer named Gottlieb Pabst and his wife Friederike. In 1848, the year of the German revolutions, when Friedrich was 12 years old, his parents emigrated to the United States. They settled first in Milwaukee, then briefly in Chicago, and it was in Chicago that Friedrich, now translated in the American way, to Frederick Hugh, went to work. He was 14. He signed on as a cabin boy on one of the side-wheel steamers of the Goodrich Line, which ran passengers and cargo between Chicago, Milwaukee, and the smaller Lake Michigan ports. He learned to navigate. He was promoted and promoted again, and by the age of 21 in 1857, he was the captain of one of Goodrich's ships, a vessel called the Huron. Until the last day of his life, no matter what he became on land, he insisted on being addressed by that title. He was always Captain Pabst. The woman who would change his life was a passenger, or more accurately, the daughter of a passenger. Her name was Maria Best, and she was 15 years old when Captain Pabst first met her on the deck of the Huron, in the company of her father, Philip Best. Philip Best owned a small but prosperous brewery in Milwaukee. His own father, Jacob Best, had founded it in 1844, together with 4 sons, and by the late 1850s, Philip had bought out his brothers and become the sole proprietor. He recognized in the young ship's captain a certain steadiness. He invited him to dinner. He introduced him to his daughter. Frederick Pabst and Maria Best courted discreetly for the better part of 2 years. They were married in Milwaukee on the 25th of March, 1862. Pabst continued to captain his ship for another year and a half. And then, on a night in December of 1863, in weather that a captain of his experience should have handled without difficulty, his ship ran aground in the Milwaukee harbor. There was no loss of life. There was, however, a moment of quiet clarity, as Pabst himself was said to have described it later, in the German-language biographies published after his death, a decision to come ashore for good. In 1864, he bought a half share in the Philip Best Brewing Company. He was 28 years old. His brother-in-law, Emil Schondine, who had married Maria's younger sister, Lisette, joined him as vice president, and Philip Best himself, 3 years later, retired to Germany. What Pabst and Schondine did with that brewery over the 2 decades that followed is one of the extraordinary industrial stories of 19th century America. By 1874, the Philip Best Brewing Company was the largest brewery in the United States. Between 1879 and 1893, it opened 40 branch offices around the country, 12 of them in Wisconsin alone. It won a gold medal at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876 and another at the Paris World's Fair in 1878. And in 1882, in a marketing gesture whose full commercial genius would not be understood until decades later, Pabst began to tie a blue silk ribbon around the neck of every bottle of his select beer to distinguish it from the products of his competitors. By 1889, the company was renamed. It was no longer Philip Best. It was Pabst. Milwaukee itself in those years had come to look and to sound like a particular kind of city, a city in which German and English were spoken in equal measure on the streetcars, in which the Turnverein gymnasiums stood beside Catholic and Lutheran churches, and in which the tallest chimneys visible from the harbor belonged not to steel mills or to grain elevators, but to the great brew houses of Pabst, of Schlitz, of Blatz, and of Miller. There was, among the German-American families of the city, a competitive but civilized understanding of the trade. The Pabsts intermarried with the Uihleins, the family who would in a moment take over Schlitz. Frederick Pabst Jr. would in time marry a daughter of August Uihlein. Their sons and daughters grew up together, at the same schools, on the same tennis courts, in the same summer houses along the shore of Lake Michigan. At the height of the 1890s, the captain lived in a mansion on Grand Avenue in Milwaukee, a mansion that still stands, and that is now a museum. 37 rooms of Flemish Renaissance detail, hand-carved oak paneling, 17 fireplaces, and a private chapel on the ground floor. He owned the Pabst Theater, an ornate concert hall which he had built at his own expense to bring German-language opera and Shakespearean drama to the Wisconsin frontier. He owned the Pabst Building, at the time the tallest office block in the state. He owned the Whitefish Bay Pleasure Resort, an elaborate lakeside entertainment park north of the city, where the summer evenings ended with fireworks and with the arrival of steamers from Chicago carrying, on the busiest weekends, thousands of visitors at a time. And in the spring of 1890, when a British syndicate approached him with an offer to buy his brewery for $16 million, nearly double its book value at the time, he refused. According to the newspaper accounts of the day, he said only this: "The money is awfully tempting, but this brewery was founded in Milwaukee, and that's where it needs to stay." It stayed. He, on the other hand, did not. Captain Pabst's health began to deteriorate at the turn of the new century. He suffered, according to the physicians who attended him at his mansion on Grand Avenue, from pulmonary edema, from diabetes, and from a form of emphysema that would have been particularly cruel to a man who had grown up on the open decks of the Great Lakes and had spent most of his winter mornings for 8 consecutive years standing in the cold wind above Lake Michigan. In the winter of 1903, while traveling in California with Maria, a trip that had been recommended by his doctor, in the belief that the mild climate might restore some of his strength, he suffered 2 strokes in quick succession. They came home to Milwaukee together by train in a private carriage that the company had arranged. He died in the family mansion on the 1st of January, 1904, at 7 in the morning on the first day of the new year. He was 67 years old. Maria survived him by 2 years. She died in 1906 in the same house of pneumonia contracted after a fall. And now the Pabst family entered what one of the historians of Milwaukee brewing has called, delicately, its dispersion. The captain had left 10 children, of whom 6 survived to adulthood. 2 of them, his sons Gustav and Frederick Jr., took over the running of the brewery. But the shareholding, which had been concentrated in his own hands and, before that, in the hands of Philip Best, now began to fragment. It fragmented among sons and daughters, and among their children, and among the children of Emile and Lisette Chandine, and among the spouses those children married. By the 1920s, no single member of the family held enough of the company to steer it alone. By the 1930s, the executives who ran it were increasingly hired managers, not blood relations. And through all of this, the company continued to make beer. It survived Prohibition in the same way that Anheuser-Busch survived, by making malt syrup, by making cheese, by turning refrigeration equipment to whatever industrial use presented itself. It survived, less easily, the rise of Anheuser-Busch after the Second World War and the rise of Miller in the 1960s. But by the late 1970s, the beer that had once been the largest in America was fourth, then fifth, then, in the marketing surveys of the late 1980s, a name that ordinary consumers no longer particularly associated with beer at all. What killed Pabst in the end was not a rival brewery. It was a Californian financier. In the mid-1980s, a corporate raider named Paul Kalmanovitz acquired a controlling stake in the company through a series of hostile actions and set about, in the language of the acquisitions of that decade, extracting value. Breweries were closed. Contracts were renegotiated. The Captain's Milwaukee brewhouse itself was shut down in 1996, 152 years after the day Jacob Best had first fired his coppers. For a period of years, no beer at all was brewed under the Pabst name. The brand survived in the way that certain American brands do survive, as a nostalgic label, contract brewed by other companies, sold in dive bars and to college students who did not know, and would have had no reason to know, that the ribbon on the neck had once been silk and blue and tied by the hands of a Milwaukee brewery girl in 1882. The Pabst descendants by then had scattered across America. Some had gone into other businesses. Some had married, as one would expect, into the Uihleins family, which we shall come to in a moment. A grandson of the captain's, a man named Augie Pabst, became a professional racing driver in the 1950s and won at Road America and at Bridgehampton before returning, briefly, to the family business. Another branch of the family took over the Pabst farms outside Milwaukee. Another simply lived on the income of a trust and traveled between Wisconsin and Florida in the pattern of a certain generation of American old money. There was no family drama, no single moment of collapse, no scandal that a Sunday newspaper could turn into a headline, only the quiet, decades-long thinning out of an inheritance that had been left, unwisely and without any binding structure, to descendants who had never had to build anything themselves. The Pabst mansion on Grand Avenue was sold in the summer of 1908 to the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Milwaukee for $97,000, and it served for the next 67 years as the residence of the local archbishop. When the Archdiocese finally sold it in 1975, it very nearly became a hotel car park. A 3-year local preservation campaign saved it, and in the spring of 1978, a Heritage Society opened it to the public as a museum that is, of the household that had lived in it for exactly 16 years, from the captain's first Christmas there in 1892 to the widow's death in 1906. The Pabst Theater still operates as a concert venue. The Pabst building was demolished in 1981 to make room for a modern office tower. And the brewhouse itself on Chestnut Street sat empty from 1996 onward, its coppers cold, until property developers converted it, around the year 2010, into a mixed-use complex of loft apartments, offices, a boutique hotel called the Brewhouse Inn, and a small craft brewery which uses one of the surviving Pabst brewing kettles as, essentially, a photograph opportunity in the lobby. Some fortunes in the end are not lost. They are only distributed until the individual portions are too small to hold anything upright. The third story begins with a fire, and it ends with a slogan. In 1848, a Bavarian immigrant named August Krug arrived in Milwaukee. He was 34 years old, and he opened a restaurant, and behind the restaurant, in a small outbuilding, he brewed a modest quantity of beer for his own customers. 2 years later, in 1850, Another German immigrant arrived in Milwaukee, a young man of 19 from the Rhineland city of Mainz. He was skilled in accounts, and he was hired by August Krug as a bookkeeper. His name was Joseph Schlitz. 6 years later, in 1856, August Krug died. He was in his 40s. He left a widow, Anna Maria Krug, and no children. In the German-American custom of the time, the running of the small brewery passed, temporarily, to the man whose accounts had held it together, and Joseph Schlitz took over. 2 years after that, in 1858, Joseph Schlitz married Anna Maria Krug, and in doing so married the brewery itself. For 17 years, Joseph Schlitz ran the company. He renamed it in 1874 for himself, the Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company. He built a new plant on King Drive in Galena Street, a facility whose brick towers can still be seen in the reflections on the Milwaukee River today. And in the fall of 1871, an accident hundreds of miles away gave him one of the most consequential opportunities in 19th century American beer. On the 8th of October, 1871 in Chicago, a fire began that burned for 3 days and destroyed most of the city's center, including almost entirely the local brewing industry. Chicago had been an enormous market for Milwaukee lager, but from that autumn, it became a desperate one. Milwaukee brewers loaded their railcars and their steamboats and sent every barrel they could south. Schlitz sent, in the year after the fire, more than double what he had ever sent before. In the marketing of the decades that followed, the company would build its entire national brand around that fact. Their slogan, printed on countless labels, painted on the sides of buildings and on the concrete floors of tied houses in every American city, was Schlitz. The beer that made Milwaukee famous, it was true, and it was, for exactly 108 years, extraordinarily lucrative. Joseph Schlitz himself did not live to see most of that century. On the 7th of May, 1875, he boarded the German ocean liner SS Schiller for a business trip to his homeland. He was 43 years old, and he had, according to his will, left detailed instructions for what should happen to the brewery in the event of his absence. The Schiller ran into a heavy fog off the Isles of Scilly, near the southwest coast of England, and struck a rock. More than 300 passengers, Joseph Schlitz among them, did not survive. His will took effect. Anna Maria, his widow, retained her share of the brewery. And the 4 nephews of August Krug, her first husband's blood relatives, took over the running of it. Their names were August, Henry, Alfred, and Edward Uihlein. 2 more brothers, William and Charles, would join them in more junior capacities. They were, all of them, born in the small town of Wertheim on the Main, in Baden. They had come to Milwaukee as boys. They had been raised, in effect, in and around this brewery, and now, in accordance with the specific instructions of a dead uncle by marriage, they inherited the running of it. They kept the name. That, too, was in the will, and for the next 3 generations, until 1976, a Uihlein was in charge. They did remarkable things. In 1883, William Uihlein traveled to Copenhagen and brought back to America the first pure culture of brewing yeast that had ever crossed the Atlantic, a scientific advance that allowed Schlitz to produce a beer of standardized character in industrial volumes. In the 1890s, the company built a chain of tied houses, bars that sold Schlitz beer exclusively, in Milwaukee and in Chicago, and many of those buildings still stand today, with the Schlitz globe logo set into their brickwork. When Anna Maria Krug Schlitz died in 1887, she willed her remaining shares to the Uihlein brothers, and from that year onward, the family owned the company outright. By the middle of the 20th century, Schlitz was, once again, the largest brewery in the United States. It had briefly been the largest in the 1890s. It became the largest again in the 1950s, and it held or contested the top position throughout the 60s. Its Milwaukee brewery, the same brick complex on King Drive, employed several thousand workers, most of them unionized, many of them the sons and grandsons of the men who had first been hired by August Uihlein in the 1880s. Its advertising budget was, by the middle of the 1960s, one of the largest in the American beverage industry. Its funding built the 4th of July fireworks over Lake Michigan. It funded the Great Circus Parade, a summer procession of restored 19th century wagons that drew, at its height, more than 1 million spectators to the shore of the lake in a single day. And it funded the Old Milwaukee Days Festival, which over time would become the summer music festival known as Summerfest, and which remains, to this day, one of the largest paid music festivals in the world. There is a photograph of the Uihlein family, taken at the brewery in 1948, the year in which, by the internal figures of the company, Schlitz sat, by a small but decisive margin, at the very top of the American brewing industry. 6 men in 3-piece suits stand in a row in front of a copper brewing kettle taller than any of them. The oldest of them is Joseph E., then in his early 70s. The youngest is Robert Uihlein Jr., who is 32 years old, and who will, 13 years later, become the president of the company. On the wall behind them, in the pale grain of the photograph, one can just make out the slogan that has been printed on labels since the 1870s. The beer that made Milwaukee famous. 33 years later, Robert Uihlein will be dead, and the room in which the photograph was taken will be under lock and key, waiting for demolition. And then, in the middle of the 1970s, at the peak of everything, the family made a decision. The man who made it was Robert Uihlein Jr., the grandson of August. He had been president of Schlitz since 1961 and chairman since 1967. He was a competent brewer and, by every account, a devoted Milwaukeean. But he was also a man who watched, with a certain increasingly bitter frustration, as Anheuser-Busch under Gussie Busch and, later as Miller Brewing Company under the Philip Morris tobacco empire, cut into the market share that Schlitz had held for so long. The decision was, in the language of the corporate case studies that would later be written about it, a decision to lower the cost of goods sold in order to protect short-term margin. It was not, in itself, an unreasonable business decision. What made it a catastrophe was that it involved changing the recipe. Beginning in the mid-1970s, Schlitz began replacing part of its barley malt with corn syrup. It shortened the fermentation cycle. It substituted a chemical stabilizer, a foam stabilizer and haze control agent, for the natural process that had, until then, kept the beer looking clear and pale in the bottle. And in 1976, the loyal Schlitz drinkers of America opened their bottles and found, floating in them, a fine, grayish, cloudy sediment. The beer was perfectly safe. That was true, and the company said so, and the newspapers of Milwaukee dutifully repeated it. But the beer looked, to the customer holding the bottle up to a bar light, like something had gone wrong with it. And when a product that people are used to trusting begins to look wrong, no amount of scientific reassurance is quite enough. Sales began to fall. The company recalled 10 million bottles and cans, discreetly, and destroyed them. The press found out. Sales fell further. The company then launched, in 1977, an advertising campaign in which large, unsmiling men, boxers, and construction workers, and off-duty policemen turned to the camera and asked, with a certain flatness in the delivery, whether the viewer was really planning to take away their Schlitz. Beer drinkers came to call it, at first affectionately and then quite unkindly, the "Drink Schlitz or I'll kill you" campaign. Sales fell further still. Robert Uihlein Jr. did not live to see the ending. He died of leukemia in 1976 at the age of 60. Leadership passed, for the first time in the company's history, out of the family and into the hands of professional managers. The professional managers could not save it. In the summer of 1981, when the company announced plans to cut around 200 jobs at its Milwaukee plant in order to bring costs down further, more than 700 workers walked out. The strike lasted 4 months. The pickets stood on King Drive in shifts in the mild Midwestern rain of that August and September, and they were joined in the evenings by their wives and by their grown children and, in some cases, by their fathers, retired brewers who had themselves put in 40 years at Schlitz and who were seeing, for the first time in the history of their families, the possibility that no son of theirs would ever draw a paycheck from the company again. In July of that year, before the strike had even ended, the board announced that the Milwaukee brewery would be closed permanently. In the summer of 1982, what was left of the company was sold to the Stroh Brewing Company of Detroit for approximately $500 million, a figure that had, 10 years earlier, been closer to several billion. The Uihlein descendants divided the proceeds. There were, by that stage, many of them. Stroh, in its turn, was unable to service the debt it had taken on to acquire Schlitz. In 1999, Stroh itself collapsed, and its brands, including Schlitz, were sold to Pabst. The two Milwaukee giants, one dead and one only a name, ended up in the same portfolio of ghosts. Pabst reintroduced Schlitz in 2008, using what it claimed to be a recovered version of the pre-1976 recipe, marketed to a new generation of American drinkers as a nostalgic dive bar beer. Sales were modest. In the spring of 2026, 177 years after August Krug had first brewed beer in a Milwaukee restaurant, Pabst quietly ended production of the brand and arranged a single ceremonial final batch to be brewed at a Wisconsin craft facility using original brewing logs recovered from an unnamed private collector museum, logs dated to 1948, the year Schlitz had, quite literally, been at the top. The Uihlein descendants, in the years that followed, did what dispersed brewing families tend to do. Some remained in Milwaukee. Some went into other businesses. One branch of the family founded the shipping and packaging company Uihlein, which became, in its own quiet way, one of the largest private companies in the American Midwest. But the beer that had made Milwaukee famous no longer belonged to them, and did not, for many years, belong to Milwaukee either. Some enterprises, in the end, are not undone by their competitors. They are undone by their own certainty that the customer would never notice the difference. Forrest Mars Sr. retired from Mars, incorporated in 1973. He was 69 years old. He turned the company over to his three children, Forrest Jr., John, and Jacqueline, with the specific instruction that no member of the family was to speak to the press about the company ever on any subject. The children obeyed him. Two of them, for the rest of their lives, would not sit for a single on-the-record interview with any American news organization. The third, Forrest Jr., would give exactly one decades later on the subject of colonial-era chocolate making to a curator at the Smithsonian. Meanwhile, in the state of Pennsylvania, in the town that Milton Hershey had built beside a cornfield in 1903, the Hershey Chocolate Corporation was in trouble. Not visible trouble, not published trouble. The company was still the largest chocolate manufacturer in the United States. It was still profitable. It was still, technically, the market leader in the American candy aisle. But at some point between 1964 and 1973, historians of the industry disagree on the exact year the annual sales of Mars, Incorporated, had quietly overtaken those of Hershey. And Hershey, by every one of the indicators that an internal marketing department could produce, was losing ground on each product category that mattered. Part of the problem was cultural. The Hershey Corporation had, since Milton's death in 1945, been run by a succession of engineers and financial managers who had, in most cases, been brought up in the Hershey Company town, been educated at Milton Hershey School or at Pennsylvania State University, and been promoted from within the Pennsylvania organization. They knew on the level of the smallest technical detail exactly how a Hershey Kiss should be manufactured. They knew almost nothing about advertising. Milton Hershey had, throughout his lifetime, refused to advertise his product at all. He had considered the practice undignified. The corporation, in the years after his death, had partly maintained the same principle. In 1969, Hershey spent, on all forms of consumer advertising for its entire product line, less than $1.5 million. Mars, in the same year, spent more than 20 times that amount. The turning point in the internal history of the Hershey Corporation came in 1976. In that year, the board of the Hershey Chocolate Corporation appointed, as its new chief executive officer, a man named William Dearden. Dearden was 55 years old. He had spent his entire career at Hershey, and he had come to the company by a route that no other candy chief executive in the world had ever come by. William Dearden was an orphan. He had been enrolled in the Milton Hershey School at the age of 5 in the mid-1920s. He had been fed at Milton Hershey's expense. He had been housed in a dormitory built during the Great Building Campaign that Milton had funded at the height of the Depression. He had been trained in his teens in one of the industrial trades the school taught. He had gone to college on a Hershey Trust scholarship. He had come back to the town, taken a junior sales position at the Chocolate Corporation in 1957, and worked his way, over the following 19 years, into the executive suite. When the board offered him the chief executive's chair in 1976, he accepted with, according to those who were in the room, one particular observation. He said that he owed the town of Hershey and the man who had built it everything he had. He proposed, therefore, to run the company as though Milton Hershey were still watching. Under Dearden, the Hershey Corporation did what it had never done. It began systematically to advertise. It hired a New York agency. It commissioned television spots. It launched the Reese's Pieces campaign, a colored candy-coated peanut butter product that had been in the company's line since 1978, and that Dearden's marketing team now placed aggressively in front of the American public. It agreed in 1982 to what would become one of the most celebrated product placements in the history of American cinema. A young Californian director had approached the Mars company that spring with a request to use a small trail of M&Ms in a scene of a family film he was then completing. The film involved a suburban California boy, a garage, and a small extraterrestrial creature who could be lured into the boy's home by the trail of candy. The director explained the concept to a Mars executive by telephone. The Mars executive, in accordance with the standing corporate instruction on all matters of publicity, refused. The director then telephoned the Hershey Corporation. Dearden's marketing office understood immediately what had just fallen into their lap. They agreed. The candy in the film was accordingly changed from M&Ms to Reese's Pieces. The film, released in June of 1982, was E.T. the Extraterrestrial. In the 4 months after the film opened, sales of Reese's Pieces increased threefold. It was, according to industry historians who would later write the case study, one of the single most consequential product placement transactions in the history of American consumer marketing. It was made possible entirely by the Mars family's constitutional inability, at that moment, to say yes to a stranger on a telephone. Under Dearden's successor, Richard A. Zimmerman, who took over in 1984, Hershey continued the counteroffensive. Zimmerman diversified the company's product line, added the Twizzlers licorice brand through the acquisition of the Y&S Candies Company, and by the middle of the decade had brought Hershey's annual advertising budget up to a level comparable to that of Mars. And in 1988, in the single largest transaction in Hershey's corporate history, Zimmerman authorized the acquisition of the United States confectionery operations of the British firm Cadbury Schweppes for approximately $300 million, bringing under the Hershey umbrella, in one movement, the Almond Joy and Mounds and York Peppermint Patty and Peter Paul brands, together with the licensing rights to the Cadbury Dairy Milk name in the American market. With the Cadbury acquisition, the American market share balance shifted for the first time in a decade and a half. In 1988, Hershey, once again, was the largest chocolate manufacturer in the United States. Mars had held the position for approximately 15 years. It would not, in the following 4 decades, permanently reclaim it. Meanwhile, in McLean, Virginia, the 3 surviving children of Forrest Mars Sr., Forrest Jr., John Franklin, and Jacqueline Yee, ran the Mars Company jointly, in a corporate culture whose watchword was the single unchanging instruction their father had given them at the point of retirement: never talk to the press. When their father died in Miami on the 1st of July, 1999, at the age of 95, they released through the company's spokesman a single sentence acknowledging his death and no further details of any kind. When Forrest Jr. himself died in Seattle on the 26th of July, 2016, of a heart attack at the age of 84, the company released a similarly brief statement. He had been one of the wealthiest men in the world. His net worth at the time of his death was estimated at more than $25 billion. There was no public memorial service. Milton Hershey, in the same month of the same year, sold roughly $100 million worth of chocolate. The Milton Hershey School, meanwhile, in its capacity as the majority beneficial owner of the Hershey Chocolate Corporation, enrolled in that same academic year roughly 2,000 orphaned or economically disadvantaged children at no cost to their families, in 12 grades of education on the campus that Milton had built for them 107 years earlier. The endowment of the school at that point had passed $17 billion. It was, by a comfortable margin, the largest single institution educational endowment in the United States on a per-student basis. It had reached that figure through nothing more complicated than the 98 years of profits reinvested and compounded from the sale of milk chocolate bars, the same milk chocolate bars that Milton Hershey had first begun to make in a rented Lancaster workshop in 1894. In 2008, in a transaction that briefly and unexpectedly returned the Mars family to the American business pages, John Franklin Mars and his siblings, through Mars Incorporated, jointly purchased the William Wrigley Jr. Company, the Chicago-based manufacturer of chewing gum and mint confections, for $23 billion. Half the financing for the deal came from the Berkshire Hathaway investment vehicle of Warren Buffett. The remainder came from the Mars family's own retained earnings, accumulated over 4 decades of a corporate policy of paying almost no dividends. It was, at the time of its announcement, the single largest privately negotiated food industry acquisition in American history. The company that emerged, the combined Mars-Wrigley confectionery operation, became briefly the largest sweets manufacturer in the world and reasserted for the first time in 20 years a Mars family lead over Hershey in the American market. It was announced through a single joint press release. Neither John Mars nor Jacqueline Mars gave an on-the-record interview about the transaction. In August of 2024, Mars Incorporated announced its intention to acquire, for approximately $36 billion, the Chicago-based food conglomerate Kellanova, the manufacturer of Pop-Tarts, Pringles, and the Cheez-It cracker line, in what would, on completion, become the largest food industry acquisition of the 21st century to that date. The deal was formally announced on the 14th of August, 2024, by joint statement of the two boards. It received Kellanova shareholder approval that November. It cleared its final regulatory hurdle at the European Commission in Brussels on the 8th of December, 2025. It closed 3 days later. Neither of the two surviving Mars siblings was quoted in any of the corresponding press releases. The Kellanova acquisition placed under the ownership of a single American family the manufacturing of a truly extraordinary proportion of the packaged snack food consumed by the American population, a proportion that neither Milton Hershey nor Frank Mars, in the 1890s or the 1920s, could have imagined would ever be assembled under a single roof. Some rivalries, in the end, are settled less on the balance sheet than on the question of what the money was all along for. Return, for a moment, to the kitchen table and the paper bag and the small brown object wrapped in silver foil. A child in the United States in the year 1999, in the year Forrest Mars Sr. died, was slightly more likely to be eating a Mars family product than a Hershey product, but only by a few percentage points. That same child, in the year 2025, is slightly more likely to be eating a Hershey product than a Mars product, but again only by a few percentage points. The American chocolate market at the beginning of the 21st century is a duopoly. It has been a duopoly for very close to 100 years. And the terms of the duopoly are, in a way that almost no American consumer thinks about while opening a candy wrapper on a train platform, extraordinary. On one side of the duopoly stands the Hershey Company. It is publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Its majority controlling shareholder, through a trust holding roughly 78% of the voting power in the corporation, is a private residential school for orphaned and economically disadvantaged children in Pennsylvania. That school, at the time of writing, has an endowment of more than $17 billion, one of the largest per capita endowments in the American educational system, and enrolls at any given moment roughly 2,100 students from kindergarten through the 12th grade at zero cost to their families. Every one of those students eats chocolate that has, in a real financial sense, been paid for by the profits of the corporation whose stock funds the school in which they are being educated. It is not an inefficient arrangement. It has been running in almost exactly the current form since the deed of trust signed by Milton and Catherine Hershey in 1909. On the other side of the duopoly stands Mars Incorporated. It is privately held. Its stock is not traded on any public exchange. Its ownership, at the time of writing, is divided among two of the three surviving children of Forrest Mars Sr., John Franklin Mars and Jacqueline Mars, both of whom are in their late 80s, and among the four adult daughters of the third child, Forrest Jr., who died in 2016. The two surviving siblings do not, in any published record, appear together in public. They have not sat in the 26 years since their father's death for a joint interview. The company they inherited had, in 2024, an annual revenue of over $50 billion. It is, by that measure, the largest privately held food company in the world. The two enterprises, in other words, have chosen almost exactly opposite ways of surviving into the 21st century. Hershey has continued to do what Milton Hershey did, to make chocolate and to fund, through the making of chocolate, an institution designed to correct, in the small circle of children it can reach, the accident of an unlucky birth. Mars has continued to do what Forrest Sr. did, to make chocolate in enormous, industrially disciplined quantities, and to leave, to the family that inherits it, an obligation to preserve, above all other obligations, the family's absolute privacy. Neither of these is, on its face, a mad way to live. Neither of them is quite what an outsider might have expected either, from a Pennsylvania caramel maker who came home broke to his mother in 1886, or from a Minnesota polio survivor who taught his boy to hand-dip chocolate on a farm kitchen table in the 1880s. What they had in common, Milton Hershey and Frank Mars, was that they both understood, before almost anyone else in America understood, that a small brown rectangle of sugar and cocoa and milk fat could become, in the 20th century, one of the essential daily pleasures of the industrial working class. What they had, in other words, was the same insight, arrived at almost simultaneously in two different states by two men who never met. What their descendants had on the two sides of the war could scarcely have been more different. On the Hershey side, an unbroken succession of engineers and orphans, running a corporation whose profits were, in a very literal sense, not their own. On the Mars side, a single family whose founding grievance, a father and a son who could not, in any decade of their overlapping lives, quite manage to talk to one another, became in the end the corporate culture of the company they built. There is in the Hershey Cemetery, on a hill above the town Milton Hershey built, a small stone mausoleum. It is not, by the standards of the Gilded Age mausolea one finds in the great cemeteries of Boston or Philadelphia, an elaborate structure. It is a single small chamber of gray Pennsylvania stone with a plain iron door and no inscriptions of any philosophical distinction on the outside. Inside, in adjacent crypts, lie Milton Snavely Hershey and Catherine Elizabeth Sweeney Hershey. There are no children in the mausoleum. There have never been any children in the mausoleum. There were never any Hershey children. On weekends throughout the year, however, and particularly on the Sundays of the school term, the small road that runs past the mausoleum is used by the students of the Milton Hershey School, who walk up the hill from their dormitories, on the way to the athletic fields at the top of the ridge. They pass the mausoleum, most of them without particular ceremony. Some of them do stop. There is in the Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis a private stone mausoleum of a very similar scale. It is set on a small rise beside a stand of oak trees. Inside it lie Franklin Clarence Mars, his second wife Ethel Veronica Healy Mars, and, since 1999, his son Forrest Edward Mars Sr. The son who spent the last 2 years of his father's life on a different continent, refusing to come home, is buried 3 feet from the man he refused to come home to. There are, so far, no other Mars family members in the mausoleum. The two surviving children of Forrest Sr., in accordance with the general instruction of the company they now run, have not, at the time of this recording, made public any plans for their own eventual burial. In due course, presumably, decisions will be made, and made privately. Some feuds in the end outlive both of the men who started them and everything they were fighting for.